In my earlier talks, I described my path to the Orthodox Church and how I was received into Orthodoxy in 1958. And I also spoke a little about Greece in my life, visits that I made to Greece from 1954 onwards. Now, I would like to speak about later stages in my life. And in fact, my life could be divided perhaps into two quite clear periods of unequal length. The first period is 1958 to 1966. From my reception into the Orthodox Communion to my ordination as priest in 66 and my appointment in that same year to a teaching position in the University of Oxford, Spalding Lecturer in Eastern Orthodox Studies. The second major period would be from 1966 up to the present time. From 1966 until 2001, 35 years, I taught in the university. Then I retired, but I continue to live in Oxford. So now I would like to look at the period 58 to 65 and 66. 52 to 58, I studied in Oxford doing undergraduate courses, first in classics, then in theology. I came back to Oxford 60 to 63 and wrote my doctoral dissertation, for which I was awarded the degree termed in Oxford Doctor of Philosophy, though my subject was definitely theology. It was an early ascetic writer, Mark the monk, who lived in Egypt or in Palestine, probably early 5th century, some of whose works are included in the Philokalia. Also, during this period, in 65, I was ordained deacon, 66 priest. So let us look more closely at those 8 years. A first and major event during that period was the publication of my first book, entitled The Orthodox Church, published by Penguin Books. That, in a remarkable way, has remained in print up until the present time. I never remotely dreamt that it would have this kind of success. Just a few days ago, I received a statement from Penguin Books, and it shows that in the last year, that book sold 4,000 copies. That it should in that way have remained in circulation over 50 years later surprises me deeply. Now, I did not take the initiative to write this book. I received an invitation out of the blue by the religious book advisor from Penguin Books, saying, We wish to publish paperback books about the main Christian communities, Anglicans, Methodists, and the Orthodox, and the Roman Catholics. Would you write the Orthodox book? I suppose they had been given my name by somebody, but certainly I was very surprised to receive this invitation, and I'd never published anything else before, apart from an occasional article. My initial reaction was to say, I am not qualified to write such a book. And I was minded to refuse. After all, I'd only become Orthodox in 58, and I felt with such short experience within the Orthodox Church, I shouldn't venture to write about it. However, my friend William Grisbrook, liturgical scholar with whom I was received into Orthodoxy in the Greek cathedral, he said to me, "You have not put yourself forward as qualified to do this. They have chosen you. Why don't you try? They've asked you. Why not respond to this challenge?" For that advice, I'm very grateful. So he and I sat down one evening to draw up a synopsis of what such a book would contain. And it was a fairly obvious scheme. First part, the history of the Orthodox Church and its contemporary situation, outward history. The second part, inward life, its theology and worship. That preliminary scheme I followed almost exactly in the published volume. Penguins, with only very small modifications, accepted my outline. They did point out that I hadn't mentioned the Bible, so I put in a section about that. I found it very hard work writing that book. In my experience, there is no form of work more demanding than to write. Many people think that's very easy. You just sit down, in my case with a fountain pen and lined paper. But nowadays people would work on their computer, I suppose, or on a typewriter, though typewriters have more or less become an archaic object. But I still write everything out longhand. And people think, oh, well, easy enough. You just jot down the first thing that comes into your head. Not a bit of it. To write a book, if you really care about it, is what the Russians would call a podvig, an ascetic task. Suffering and endurance is required. And I have found in experience that those things that I write easily at the time, I think, oh, this is wonderful. When I look at them years later, I think, no, nothing very much here, all very superficial. Those things that I have suffered to write, that have had to be rewritten again and again, that were a real endurance test for me, when I look at them later, I think, yes, not so good, but at least they have some value in them. Writing, then, in my experience, is hard work, though it gives you great fulfillment. But I have never felt satisfied with anything that I have written. Now, my Penguin book, published in 1963, was accepted by the publishers with very few modifications. It was rather longer than they had intended, but they didn't seem to mind about that. I suppose that I was lucky. This was the first general account of the Orthodox Church to be published by not a religious specialist publisher, but a wide-ranging publishing house with a very large clientele. So I was the first person to write a study of the Orthodox Church that appeared in a paperback series intended for universal distribution. That helped me. My critics were sometimes surprisingly kind, but that book was attacked on two grounds. The first, that I was much too favorable to the Russian exile jurisdiction, Rokor. And that is not surprising, because though I was received into the Greek Church, always maintained close relations of friendship with Rokor people. And in those days they were marginalized. The bulk of what was published in English about Orthodoxy was favorable to the Moscow Patriarchate. The second grounds on which I was attacked was that in the final chapter on work for Christian unity, I was far too negative. At some points in subsequent editions I have toned a few things down, but fundamentally I have not changed my views. However, I do distance myself rather more from the Rokor position in later editions. I did a second edition of my Penguin book in 1993, in which I rewrote about 1/3 of the whole. There had been so many changes since 1963, particularly in the situation of the Orthodox Church in the former communist countries, that I needed to modify things very extensively. That book had a considerable influence on my life. It's always been the best known of any of the things that I've written. And certainly it would have been that book, among other things, which helped me to get the appointment to the lectureship in Oxford, where my professional teaching work was spent. I am very grateful to the unknown person who recommended me to Penguin Books. At the same time, I bear in mind the story of an author in a cauldron of boiling water. Perhaps you have heard it. There was a very distinguished author who died and woke up to find himself in a cauldron of boiling water. And every now and then demons approached with burning logs and placed them under his cauldron. The water grew hotter and hotter, and he was in great discomfort. After a time he looked out, and he saw somebody in a nearby cauldron of water. But in his case, the demons only put a burning log every now and then underneath his cauldron to keep the water pleasantly hot, but not boiling. And here the man was reclining at his ease, with great pleasure. So the author said to him, "Why are you here? What have you done?" And the man replied, "I murdered my wife." At once the author became extremely indignant, and he summoned the demons and he said, "Is there no justice in this place? Here am I, a famous writer, admired very widely, and you keep putting burning logs under my cauldron, and I'm extremely uncomfortable in this boiling water. And here is a man who's done something very dreadful, and you leave him alone, and he's just reclining at his ease." "Yes," said the demons, "he did murder his wife, but she's forgiven him, and so that's all right. But you wrote books, and people go on buying your books and reading them, and you go on doing great harm through the things you have written. And every time somebody buys one of your books, we put another burning log under your cauldron." This led me to be cautious about being admired for anything that I wrote. I think of the boiling cauldron. You may recall that there was a certain Count Gobineau in the 19th century who wrote a book about different races and how some races were superior to others. Nobody took much notice of this until in the 20th century a young man named Adolf Hitler read this book, and he was very impressed by it. So when he came to power, he put it into practice and started to exterminate the Jews. So this shows how you can do damage through what you write. I hope I've not done too much damage through my Penguin book. What else was going on in the period between my reception into orthodoxy and my ordination? After I had completed my doctoral dissertation, or at any rate completed the research for it, in 1963 I was invited to Montreal. I received, again, a letter out of the blue from the Russian Rokhor bishop there, Archbishop Vitaly Ustinov, who later became Metropolitan Vitaly. Later he became head of Rokhor. And he said that he had a small monastic community. Would I be interested in coming to join him? He needed an English Orthodox who would help with English Orthodox work in his monastery and in his diocese. And he described to me the different members of his monastery. I remember a picturesque phrase that he had. One of them, he said, is a former old gentleman. I was interested in the word former. Was he no longer old? Had he become young again? Or was he no longer a gentleman? So I didn't find out the answer to that. I went to join Vladika Vitaly. He was much the most severe person that I have ever known. And it became clear to me fairly quickly that this was not the place for me. It also became clear to him. And after 6 months, I left and came back to England early in '64. I remember one incident from my time in Montreal. One of the monks had acquired an aged television set, and we were allowed to go and watch it on Sunday afternoons. At this time, the Beatles, which some of you may remember, musical team, were at the height of their fame. And there came onto the television screen a picture of the Beatles performing, and thousands of young ladies screaming with delight. Federico Vitali came into the doorway and watched this with a dark and thunderous countenance. And he said, after a time, "I think this is a question of mass demonic possession." He was not joking. I returned to England then in the spring of '64. The Orthodox situation had greatly changed. When I was received into the Orthodox Church, though I had not asked to be ordained, I never asked to be ordained. It was others who took the initiative, though from early childhood I'd hoped I would to be ordained. When I was 5 years old, I remember I had two ambitions. One was to be a bishop, and the other was to be a station master. When I went with my nanny to visit her parents in the country, we got off at the wayside station, and I recall how the station master would be standing there, his cap with gold braid, a portly figure, his gold watch chain across his waistcoat. He would raise his green flag, and the train, a steam train of course, would continue on its way. And I thought as a child, that's what I want to do when I grow up. Well, I've realized one of those ambitions. It's a little late perhaps to try to be a station master. These days in England and elsewhere, so many of the stations have been closed. There are more bishops around than station masters. But at any rate, from a very early age, I'd been attracted to the idea that I might serve the church in ordination. But I never actually asked as an Orthodox to do that. And I remember when I was received by the Greek bishop, Bishop James, in London, he said to me, in a kind way, "Please bear in mind that you could never ever be ordained to the priesthood. We only want Greek priests." He did modify that by saying, "Go to the Russians if you want to be ordained. Go to America. They ordain anybody." I said to him, "I'm perfectly happy to be an Orthodox layman, and I can serve the church, if you wish, in that way." The situation changed in 1964 when a new Greek archbishop arrived, Archbishop Athinagoras Kokkinakis. He came after being many years in America, and he had very different ideas from Bishop James Virdavos and the previous archbishop in London. I had happened to meet him when I was in America in 1960, and so when I returned from Montreal, uncertain what I would do next, I went and called on him. When I had met him in 1960, he said, "Stay with me and I will ordain you deacon and you'll help me with English work." I answered, "I've only been Orthodox 2 years. It's much too soon for me to consider anything like ordination. I need to have experience as a lay person in Orthodoxy." He had not forgotten that earlier meeting, and when I called on him 4 years later in London, he said to me, 4 years ago, I offered you the opportunity of working with me and of becoming my deacon, and you refused. Now I am not asking you, I am telling you, instructing you. You will stay with me and you will serve me, helping as my English secretary, and I will ordain you. I went to see my spiritual father, Father George Sheremetyev of Rockor, and he said to me, I knew you wouldn't stay with Vladika Vitali, because he actually knew Vitali personally. It is much better for you to be with the Greeks. We in Rockor are becoming too narrow. You will not be happy with us. Accept the offer of Archbishop Athenagoras. And after all, I had been received by the Greeks, so I was not, as it were, changing from one group to another, except that in Montreal I had, of course, been in a monastery of Rockor. So, in due course, I stayed with Archbishop Athenagoras, and I helped him with English Orthodox work, doing his English correspondence. Initially, I didn't have a great deal of work to do, so I was free to go off to the British Library and work on my own research. Then, after a number of months, early in 1965, he ordained me as deacon. But before that, he had sent me to live in Greece in the monastery of Patmos. He himself was a Patmian by birth. He had been brought up there. He had become a monk in the monastery there. But at that time in Patmos, island in the eastern Aegean, the Dodecanese, times were difficult. The Dodecanese between 1912 and 1947 was under Italian rule, and the Italians wished the Orthodox to become uniates, and therefore they were forbidding the monastery in Patmos, the monastery of the theologian, a great historical monastery, to accept any new monks. And Deacon Theodoritos, as he was then, later Athenagoras, was warned that the Italians were going to arrest him because he was active in promoting the work of the monastery. And so he fled to Alexandria and in due course went to America. And he had not lived in Patmos since then. But he kept up his connections. His relatives were in Patmos, which since 1947 had been quite rightly part of Greece. So I was sent to the monastery of Patmos in the autumn of 1965. By this time I was deacon. Patmos at that time was isolated. Now it's visited by thousands of tourists daily in the season. But in those days there was just a boat once a week from Athens. Certainly in the monastery I was the only non-Greek. Though I do remember one monk, Father Pantelimon. I'd visited Patmos, as I've told you, back in 1961 to look at manuscripts, and I think I told you about the fourth noise. Well, he took me under his wing and he helped me. I corrected his English. I remember asking him one morning, how do you feel this morning? And he said, I am so-and-so. I said, no, you should actually say, I am so-so. But I said you could say, I am a so-and-so, but that would have a rather different meaning from the fact you're not feeling very well this morning. So I spent about 8 or 9 months in Patmos, in the monastery, as the only non-Greek. Sometimes I found it difficult. Much of the services were done at high speed. They read the Psalter very quickly so that I could not understand it. So, in order to not to be without prayer, I used to say the Jesus prayer. That was how I learned to say the Jesus prayer. But I recall in Lent, one day, feeling a little restless. It was cold in the church. The Lenten Matins consist largely of reading from the Psalter, about 45 minutes every day. In the Byzantine Rite, the whole Psalter is read twice during Lent. I thought, well, I could go up to my cell and say the Jesus prayer more comfortably there. And then I thought, when I got to my cell, well, I could say the Jesus prayer lying down on my bed, which I did. At that moment there was a startling development. There was no central heating in the monastery. I had just an antique electric fire, which was my only heating. I turned it on. As soon as I lay down, the cell was filled with a brilliant green flash. Not the uncreated light. It was, in fact, my antique electric fire that had exploded. So there was a clear sign that I should stay in church even if I could not follow the reading of the Psalter. I had no heating for the rest of a cold Lent, and served me right. The monks in the monastery were extremely kind to me, so I'm not complaining about that. But it was not so easy. So then, Archbishop Athenagoras fulfilled his promise and made me a deacon in 65. Then, in the middle of my time in Patmos, I had need to go back to England to attend to certain things, and he said to me, I will now ordain you priest. I said, this is a little sudden. He said, I've given you 3 days warning. On the Holy Mountain, when they're going to ordain a priest, he only has 2 days warning, so you are lucky. So he duly ordained me priest, and I learnt to serve as priest in the monastery. But in that same year, 1966, an important development occurred in my future life. As well as being ordained priest, I was invited by the University of Oxford to assume the position of Spalding Lecturer in Eastern Orthodox Studies. My predecessor had been the Russian Orthodox theologian and ecumenist Nicholas Zernov, whom I've already mentioned. I might say that in Oxford, a lecturer has a rather more status and independence than would apply to other universities. In those days, very few people had the title professor, but as lecturer I was not assistant to any professor. I had tenure, and I was entirely free to organize my own teaching. So I went back to Oxford in 1966. Oxford has distant Orthodox roots. In the 17th century, several Greeks came to study in the university. Mitrophanes Kritopoulos was one of them, 6 years at Oxford, later Patriarch of Alexandria, author of one of the Orthodox confessions of faith that is numbered among the so-called Orthodox symbolical books. Another Greek at Oxford in the 17th century was a certain Nathaniel Canopios, later Metropolitan of Smyrna, and he is reputed with introducing to Britain the practice of drinking coffee. Never before and never since has the Orthodox Church exercised such a direct influence on the English way of life. So I had illustrious predecessors. At the end of the 17th century, there was even a scheme to establish a Greek college in Oxford. That would have been the equivalent of the College of St. Athanasios, the Greek college in Rome, except that the Greeks would have been brought up not in the principles of Catholic theology, but in the principles of High Anglican theology. That scheme came to nothing because there wasn't enough money. At Oxford, and broadly speaking, in the years since then, including my retirement, I had 4 main tasks. The first was to act as a teacher, but that came to an end in 2001 when I retired. The second was to be parish priest of the Greek Orthodox community in Oxford. I retired also from that in 2001. The third was to act as delegate to the Ecumenical Patriarchate in the dialogues with the international dialogues with the Roman Catholic Church and with the Anglican Church. And that continued until last year, 2016, when I resigned. And the fourth task in that period since 66 has been to write and to translate and edit, and that still goes on. Let me say something about my teaching in Oxford. First of all, I had to give lectures on Eastern Orthodox studies. The course I particularly enjoyed giving was the mystical theology of the Greek Fathers. And I used, in fact, to subdivide it into 3 sections. The first period was to take us up to the middle of the 5th century, St. Diadochus of Photiki. The second was to include the Middle Byzantine period, the Dionysian writings, St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Simeon the New Theologian. And the third section was 14th century, Hesychasm, the 2 Gregories, St. Gregory of Sinai and St. Gregory Palamas. I was encouraged that there was always quite a lot of interest in those lectures, even though they weren't directly related to the undergraduate syllabus of theology. But I did give bread and butter lectures for subjects which all the theology students would have to take in their examinations. At that time there was a paper on early Christian doctrine, patristics, which was a core subject and had to be taken by all students. Today, in these dissolute ages, it's only become optional. But I used to lecture on the doctrine of the Holy Trinity and sometimes on the doctrine of the person of Christ in the Greek Fathers. And I enjoyed doing these lectures. Though when I first began to lecture, I felt distinctly nervous. Just around the time when I first became a lecturer, two things happened. Someone else who was beginning to lecture, in his first lecture, prepared what he thought was enough material to last for the whole hour. But in his extreme nervousness, he read it so quickly that he finished in 20 minutes. Now, what he should have done would have been to start all over again, because the audience had understood nothing. But instead, he looked at them in an alarmed way and said, "I'm sorry, that's all I've got to say." And he rushed out. But in his extreme nervousness, instead of taking the door out from the lecture hall, he went and shut himself in a broom cupboard and had to be let out ignominiously by his audience. So when I began to lecture, I looked very carefully to see where the broom cupboard was and which was the proper exit. I have to say that I've never dried up in a lecture. My problem has always been I have too much to say. The other awful warning I had was happening to one of the more senior lecturers, who used to begin his lecture in theology with a prayer. None of the other people did that at that time or since. He used to lecture in a particular room on Tuesdays and Thursdays, whereas a mathematical professor lectured there on Wednesdays and Fridays. One day he confused the days of the week, and he went in on Wednesday when the audience was mathematicians. Being a shy man, he didn't look at his audience, but he went up into the rostrum and said a prayer. Then he realized the audience were a little restive, and he suddenly understood that he'd come in on the wrong day and with the wrong audience. So he left without any explanation. And a moment later, in came the mathematician, who was surprised that his audience seemed to be in a rather disturbed state. As well they might be. An unknown clergyman had come in, said a prayer, and then walked out. So I thought, when I lecture, I must be very careful to have the right audience there, not to go in on the wrong day or into the wrong room. I might say I've never, in fact, made a mistake there. But that was a warning, along with the broom cupboard. At first I didn't enjoy lecturing very much, but later on I got into my stride and was quite happy doing so. And that is important, because if you don't enjoy doing something, it's unlikely that your audience will enjoy it very much either. My main work as a teacher, however, was not delivering lectures, but rather acting as supervisor to people who were preparing their doctoral dissertations. I was lucky. I had some very distinguished doctoral students. There is, I believe, a Jewish proverb which says, "Blessed is the teacher who has pupils who are more clever than he is," and I had that blessing. My pupils have gone on to be scattered across the world in different positions. Professor Constantine Niarchos, for example, in Athens, lecturing actually in the philosophy faculty, not in theology. Andreas Tillerides, now Metropolitan Makarios in Nairobi, mainly with a black flock, though he is Greek himself. Athanasios Hatsopoulos, Metropolitan Athanasios of Achaia, titular bishop, who represents the Greek Church to the European community in Brussels. And perhaps the best known of my many pupils, I'm only mentioning a few examples, Metropolitan Hilarion of Volokolamsk, Hilarion Alfeev, who wrote a dissertation on St. Simeon the New Theologian, which has been published. He arrived, obviously having done a lot of preparatory work, but he is an extremely hard worker, the kind of person who can work a 16-hour day or more. He arrived, and in his first term, he gave me 55,000 words to read. And I said, look, you will have to spend 2 years resident in Oxford, because we don't award distance degrees. So you'd better find something to do 2 years, not to write 55,000 words a term when your thesis cannot be more than 100,000 words. So, of course, I had lots of changes to suggest in his 55,000 words, but he does good work. And so I said, why don't you go off and learn Syriac, which he did under a distinguished Syriac scholar in Oxford, a close friend of mine, Sebastian Brock. And out of that came another book that he wrote on St. Isaac of Nineveh, Isaac the Syrian. So he was probably the most industrious of my many pupils. Another very hard-working pupil that I had was Father John Baer, who is now the Dean of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary in New York. So I was lucky in the many pupils that I had. But at the same time, I was appointed by Archbishop Athenagoras to be in charge of a Greek parish in Oxford. There had been a Russian parish back since the 1940s, but no Greek parish. The Greeks had gone to the Russian church, and sometimes they had Greek services there. And I therefore founded the Greek parish of the Holy Trinity. But the Russians said to me, our numbers are small, and that was true of both the Greeks and Russians at that time. Don't set up a separate Greek parish. Combine with us. Let's have a single community for Greeks and Russians, a single liturgy on Sundays. And their priest begged me to do that. He was a fellow Englishman, and he was ill and could not come every Sunday. I thought, well, how strange that we two Englishmen should one be Greek and the other Russian and not work together. So, in fact, from the beginning, I served in what was an inter-Orthodox community. And that still continues to be the situation, though now in Oxford a separate Russian parish has been started and a separate Romanian parish. But we still have our Greek-Russian parish using 3 languages every Sunday, but increasingly we use English because the younger Greeks don't really know much Greek. Indeed, it's a problem whether the older Greeks understand the Church Greek well, and certainly the Russians do not understand Church Slavonic now. Perhaps they did before the Revolution. But I have had Russians who have become Christian as adults, people who were university professors and the like, highly educated. And they have said to me the first time we really understood the services was when we heard them in English. So that was my second task, to be a parish priest, a part-time priest, or really spare time, because I didn't take any stipend, as I had more than enough to live on from the university. Hard work doing both jobs. I suppose the parish took up at least 30 hours each week. It would have been very difficult if I'd been a married priest. My family would have suffered, my children would never have seen me. But it worked all right because I was a monastic priest and without, therefore, any family obligations. Then my other two tasks, I will speak about them in my next talk. My participation, that is to say, in ecumenical work, in the different dialogues between the churches, and then my writing and my translating. But for the moment, let us pause.